The watch was in a glass case about 15 feet from where I was standing. Spotlit. A velvet pad the color of midnight blue. I could see from the mop handle that the case was brass and enamel. The kind of white enamel that only the best houses used in the 1880s. Patek, Vacheron, a few others. The case alone was probably worth $8,000 to $10,000, maybe more, depending on condition. The woman who had just grabbed my arm to keep from going down on the wet floor was straightening herself back up. She had on heels that cost more than my truck. Her associate, a younger man in a slim gray suit, was pretending to look at something else. She glanced at my uniform. Then she looked at the case and said it with a small smile, like it was a pleasantry, like she was doing me a favor by including me in the room at all. "I don't suppose you'd know what that watch is worth." I looked at the watch for a moment. Not at her. At the watch. The case was correct. The engraving pattern around the rim was consistent with Geneva work from that period. The hinges looked original. But the dial had a quality to it that didn't sit right. Too even. The printing on the chapter ring was precise in a way that 1889 printing wasn't quite precise, and there was something about the way the seconds hand moved that you could only see if you had spent years watching seconds hands move. I said, "The movement inside that watch is not original. The case is 1889. What's inside it is 1920s, maybe later. Whoever put it together knew what they were doing, but it's not what you think it is." She stopped smiling. Her associate laughed once, quickly, and then stopped when she didn't. I pushed the mop bucket toward the far corner of the entryway, where the tiles met the carpet runner, and got back to work. But before I tell you what happened next, I should tell you how a man like me ends up mopping floors at a library gala in the first place. I was 23 years old when I took the train from New York to Geneva. I had a duffel bag, a letter of introduction from a professor at NYU who had studied under the man I was going to meet, and about $400 in a checking account. The letter was addressed to Franz Eder. Franz had been making and repairing mechanical timepieces since 1961. He had worked for Patek Philippe in his 30s, left to open his own atelier in the old city, and by the time I arrived he was 71 years old and small, and he wore the same brown cardigan every day I ever saw him, with a loop on a cord around his neck that he never took off even to eat. He read the letter. He put it down. He handed me a pocket watch in pieces, movement, case, crown, crystal, all of it laid out on a cloth, and he said, in English that was better than my French, "Put it back together." He sat down at his own bench and went back to what he was doing and did not look at me again for 2 hours. I put it back together. It wasn't perfect. He looked at it for about 45 seconds. He said, "You'll do." That was the beginning of 11 years. What Franz taught me was not just mechanics, though the mechanics were extraordinary, the geometry of an escapement, the way a mainspring stores and releases energy, the tolerances involved in work that operates in fractions of a millimeter. What he taught me, the thing that turned out to matter most, was how to read a timepiece the way you read a face. Every watchmaker leaves a signature in his work, even when he doesn't mean to. The way he polishes a bridge, the depth he cuts a jewel setting, the specific geometry of a hand. When you have handled enough pieces from enough periods, you stop identifying them by logic alone. You start to feel when something is wrong the way you feel a change in the weather. Not from data, exactly, but from everything you've absorbed without knowing you were absorbing it. I spent 3 years with Franz. Then I went back to New York, and with his recommendation, I got a position at Holt & Vane, one of the 3 or 4 auction houses that handled serious horological estates. The kind where a single lot might carry a $250,000 estimate, where the provenance of a timepiece was researched for months before it appeared in a catalog. My job was authentication and condition assessment. I traveled. I handled things that had been in families for 150 years. I sat in rooms with collectors who had spent their lives building these collections, and I understood, genuinely understood, what they had done. I was good at the work. I knew I was good at it in the way you know any true thing about yourself, not from arrogance, but from evidence. 3 times in 11 years I flagged pieces that other experts had passed. Once it was a pocket watch that a London dealer was selling as an early breguet. The movement had been correctly identified, but the case was a later reproduction, and I could tell by the way the lug catches had been machined. Once it was a set of carriage clocks with a provenance letter that didn't match the serial numbers, once I traced them through the factory records. The third time was a wristwatch that turned out to have been stolen from a private collection in Vienna in 1947. That one brought in the FBI, briefly, and I sat in a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon answering questions from two agents who kept calling me "Sir," in a way that made me feel old even though I was 31. I was 31 when Diane told me. We had been married for 3 years. We had a routine. She taught 4th grade. I traveled for work about a third of the year. We met for dinner on Wednesday nights at the same Thai place on Amsterdam Avenue where the owner knew her by name. She was the kind of woman who remembered the names of everyone who served her food, everyone who handed her a package, everyone whose job was to be invisible in the rooms she moved through. I loved her for a lot of things, but that was one of them. She told me over the phone because she had gotten the results while I was in Amsterdam looking at a collection. She said it plainly, without softening it, the way she said hard things to her students. Here is the fact. Here is what it means. Here is what we do next. Glioblastoma. Stage 4. She said the doctors had given her a range, and she didn't want to tell me the range over the phone. I flew home that night. I remember the flight in flashes. The small screen on the seat back in front of me showing a route map, the dot of the plane moving west, the black of the Atlantic below. The range was 14 to 20 months. She lived 18. May was born 7 months after the diagnosis. Diane insisted. She said, "I am not spending the time I have waiting for it to end. I'm spending it beginning things." May arrived in February. She was small and serious-looking from the first day, this baby with dark eyes that watched everything. Diane called her the observer. She said May was going to be a scientist or a judge. She said it like she would be there to find out which. She wasn't. May was 4 years and 2 months old when Diane died. She was home, in our bed, on a Tuesday morning in March. It was early and the light was gray and May was still asleep in the next room. I was holding Diane's hand, and then I wasn't, not really. And then the hospice nurse was in the doorway, and I remember thinking I should get up and check on May before she woke up alone. And I did. And May was still asleep. And I sat on the edge of her bed, and I didn't cry yet, because there was too much to do. And I think I sat there for a long time. I had already left Holton Vane by then. I had left 8 months after the diagnosis. I needed to be home. I needed predictable hours and no travel and proximity to the elementary school where May would eventually go. I looked at the custodial posting at Millfield Public Library because the hours were 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., and the school was 4 blocks away, and the pay was enough if we were careful. I took it. I did not tell them what I had done before. It didn't seem relevant. The job was to keep the building clean, and the lights working, and the carts loaded, and I was good at that too. The wooden box with my tools went into the back of the hall closet. I didn't open it for a long time. May started kindergarten the September after Diane died. She carried the watch on the first day. She had been carrying it since the spring, since she found it in Diane's jewelry box and held it and looked at it, and I didn't take it from her. It was a small brass hunting case pocket watch that Diane had found at an estate sale years before we met, before we had anything, when she was 24 and had $20 to spend and thought it was beautiful. She wasn't wrong. The engraving on the case was original and fine. The movement had stopped the night Diane died. Not symbolically, it had simply run down, it needed winding, and I never wound it again, and May never asked me to. The ritual started maybe 3 months after Diane died. I don't know where May got it. One night I was walking past her room to brush my teeth and I stopped in the doorway because she was sitting on the edge of her bed with the watch flat on her palm, face up, and she was counting quietly. Not playing. Counting. 1, 2, 3, up to 10. Then she set it on the nightstand and lay down. I stood in the doorway until her breathing slowed. Then I went to brush my teeth and I stood over the sink for a while with the water running. She still does it. Every night. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Nightstand. Sleep. I still watch from the doorway. I don't think she knows I'm there. So that is how a man like me ends up mopping the entryway of an arts center on a Thursday evening, while an auction house CEO steadies herself on his arm and asks if he knows what a watch is worth. I said what I said. I went back to mopping. I finished the entryway. did the corridor off the main hall, replaced a burned-out bulb in the coat check alcove, signed the log sheet at the service entrance, and drove home in my truck. May was at her friend Petra's house for the evening. Petra's mother, Sandra, had started picking May up on Thursday nights when she noticed I worked events sometimes and didn't always get home before dark. That kind of thing happens when you live somewhere long enough. People quietly arrange themselves around you. I picked May up at 9. She fell asleep in the truck on the way home. I carried her inside, took the watch out of her jacket pocket, set it on her nightstand. I stood in the doorway until her breathing settled. Then I went to the kitchen and ate something standing at the counter and didn't think about the watch in the case, or not much. I thought about it more the next day. I thought about it while I was loading the returns cart at 6:45 in the morning with the building still dark outside and the fluorescents still warming up to their full hum. The movement I had seen through the glass, across 15 feet, in ambient light and a single spotlight, it wasn't something I could be certain about from that distance. I knew that. A lot of watchmakers would have made the same case. The enamel dial work could have been period correct, and I might have been wrong about the printing. The second's hand could have been a replacement without the movement itself being a replacement. But I didn't think I was wrong. 3 days passed. I didn't hear anything. I didn't expect to. On the 4th day, a woman called the library main number and asked for me by name. The librarian at the desk, Mrs. Potts, came to find me in the periodicals room where I was reshelving magazines, and she had an expression on her face like she was delivering news she didn't fully understand. She said, "There's a woman on the phone asking for you specifically. She says her name is Vivian Ashford." I took the call in the break room. Vivian Ashford did not waste time. She said she had hired an independent expert from Chicago, a woman named Dr. Lorraine Fisk, who had 30 years in horological authentication. And Dr. Fisk had concluded, after a full examination, that the movement inside the Patek Philippe case was a replacement from approximately 1928 to 1935. The case was genuine 1889. The watch was worth approximately $8,000, not $340,000. She said this in the tone of someone delivering a deposition, flat, controlled. Then she was quiet for a moment and she said, "How did you know?" I told her about Franz. I told her about Holt and Vane. I kept it brief. She asked 2 or 3 specific questions, the kind of questions that told me she had some knowledge herself, or had been talking to people who did. And then she said, "Thank you," and the call was over. 2 days after that, an FBI agent named Cahill called me. He was polite and thorough. He asked me to describe exactly what I had observed at the gala and what I had said and to whom. I told him. He asked if I would be willing to provide a formal statement. I said yes. He said he'd be in touch about when and where. What I learned later, over the following weeks, in pieces, through Agent Cahill and eventually through news coverage, was this. Carter Henning, the expert Vivian had trusted for 6 years, had certified the movement as original, knowing it was not. He had done this in exchange for a fee arrangement with the estate's executor, a man named Grant Fulton. Fulton had acquired the watch years earlier, identified the original movement as damaged beyond reasonable restoration, replaced it with a period-adjacent movement that was worth perhaps $300, and then arranged the paperwork to support the fiction that the piece was intact and original throughout. The gap between $8,000 and $340,000 was the profit they intended to split. Fulton had done it 3 times before. Not with watches, with a long case clock from a Connecticut estate, with a set of scientific instruments from a deceased professor's collection, with a small group of antique barometers from a family in western Pennsylvania. Different categories, different experts, the same structure. Grieving families in the middle of liquidating estates, trusting the process, not knowing what they didn't know. $3,600,000 in combined estimates across all 4 cases. The families had been paid well below what they were owed because the inflated items ate the auction room's attention and credibility. I thought about that a lot. The families. The fact that what Fulton had found was a way to use grief as a cover, the moment when people are least equipped to scrutinize anything, when they are just trying to get through and move forward and close out accounts and divide and donate and finalize the life of someone they have loved. And he had slid his hand into that moment. Quietly. With paperwork. I thought about it on the drive to work and on the drive home and while I was making dinner and while I was waiting in the school pickup line. I didn't say anything about it to anyone. May asked me at dinner one night if I was okay, and I said I was fine, and she looked at me for a moment with those steady eyes, and then she went back to her food. She has always known when not to push. 11 days after the gala, I got to the library at 5:50 in the morning. The sun was just coming up, and the light on the street was the particular orange-gray that only happens in early October, when summer is definitively gone but the trees haven't caught on yet. I let myself in the service entrance, started the cart, and went to the fiction section to begin the overnight returns. I heard him come in at 6:20. The service entrance was unlocked during my shift. He didn't knock. He was a large man, maybe 50, in a camel coat that was very clean. He moved through the building like he owned it, which was something I recognized, the way certain men walk into other people's spaces. He came down the aisle and stopped at the end of my cart. I kept shelving, spine out, alphabetical. He watched me for a moment. Then he said, "You're Thomas Crane." I didn't answer. He said, "Your daughter, May Crane. She's at Millfield Elementary." He said it the way you say something you know will land, not loud. Very even. He let the silence come in after it. I put a book on the shelf, then another. Crane, M to Crane, S. I was aware of my hands. I made sure my hands didn't stop. He said, "This has been a misunderstanding, the kind of misunderstanding that can be straightened out. I'm sure you can see that." I shelved 2 more books. He said, "I think we both want the same thing. We want this to be simple. We want nobody to be inconvenienced any further." I went around the end of the cart to the next section. He followed. Then I walked to the circulation desk. The phone there is one of those old push-button desk phones, the kind that libraries still have because they work. I picked it up. I dialed. It rang twice. Agent Cahill answered. I said, "This is Thomas Crane. I'm ready to give my formal statement." There was a pause on the line. Agent Cahill said, "Mr. Crane, is Mr. Fulton with you right now?" I said yes. He said, "Please stay where you are." I set the receiver down, not hung up, down on the desk. I went back to the cart and went back to shelving. Fulton stood in the fiction aisle for a moment. Then he walked toward the service entrance. I watched him go without turning my head. I was still shelving when the county car pulled into the lot at 6:41. I watched through the window at the end of the stacks. 2 uniformed officers and 1 plainclothes. Fulton was at his car, keys out. The conversation took about 45 seconds. I finished the fiction returns. I moved to biography. The investigation ran for several months. I gave 2 formal statements and answered questions on 3 other occasions by phone. Carter Henning cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for consideration on his sentencing. Fulton did not cooperate. The families from all 4 fraud cases were eventually identified and compensated, not by the legal process, which moves slowly and uncertainly, but by Vivian Ashford, who made a decision early on to act before the courts required anything of her. She came to the library on a Wednesday morning in November. She did not call ahead. She found me in the periodicals room and she said, "Do you have a few minutes?" We sat at one of the reading tables near the window. She had a legal pad and a pen. She looked tired in a way that expensive people rarely let themselves look in front of strangers. She said the firm had already compensated all 4 families. She said she had terminated Henning, restructured her authentication protocols, and brought in an outside audit of every lot they had handled in the past 8 years. She said she was telling me this not because she needed my approval, but because she thought I deserved to know. Then she said she would like to offer me a consulting retainer. She named a number. It was a good number. It was the kind of number that changes the shape of a year. I said no. She looked at me for a moment and I could see her recalibrating. Most people, when you turn down a number like that, want to negotiate. She didn't negotiate. She said, "What would you want then?" I told her about the Diane Crane reading collection. I had been thinking about it for a few weeks, a small educational program, something that could run through public library systems in Ohio. Horological literacy, the history of mechanical timekeeping, how to identify period pieces, how to ask the right questions, how to be a more informed participant when you're settling an estate, and someone hands you a timepiece and says, "Here is what this is worth." Materials for general readers. Nothing academic. Just the kind of baseline knowledge that might mean one fewer family gets walked over in a quiet room with expensive paperwork. I said I'd like the program to be called the Diane Crane Reading Collection. I told Vivian that Diane was my wife. I said it plainly, the same way Diane always said hard things. Vivian wrote something on the legal pad. She looked up. She said, "Done." She said it the way you say something when you mean it entirely. After she left, I stood at the window and watched her car pull out of the lot. Then I went back to the periodicals room and finished the reshelving I had been doing when she arrived. It took about 20 minutes. Then I got the cart for the reference section and started there. That night I made pasta for dinner, the simple kind with olive oil and garlic, because May likes it and because it only takes the one pan. She sat at the table and told me about something that had happened in music class. A boy had dropped the xylophone, and it had made a tremendous sound, and the music teacher had said a word that was definitely not a music word. I laughed. She laughed. We ate. I did the dishes. May brushed her teeth, and I heard her in the bathroom, and then the light under her door went dark. I stood in the doorway. She had the watch on her palm, face up. Her feet were flat on the floor. She wasn't looking at the watch. She was looking at some middle distance, the way you do when you're concentrating on something that isn't in the room. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then she set the watch on the nightstand, face up, and lay down and pulled the blanket to her chin. She turned on her side. I stood there until her breathing slowed and steadied. I went to the hall closet. The wooden box was on the top shelf, behind a pair of winter boots that no longer fit either of us and a rolled-up vinyl banner from May's 3rd birthday that I had been meaning to throw out for 2 years. I got a chair and reached the box down. I carried it to the kitchen table. I don't know exactly why I opened it that night and not some other night. Maybe it was the conversation with Vivian. Maybe it was watching Fulton walk to his car in the October morning. Maybe it was just the pasta and the xylophone story and the ordinary particular texture of a night that felt, for the first time in a long time, like enough. I set the box on the table and opened the lid. The loop was on top. I'd kept it clean when I packed it away, and it was still clean, the lens clear and unfogged. Under it was the leather roll tied with a cord. I undid the cord and unrolled it on the table. The tweezers, the picks, the case openers, 12 tools in 12 loops, the leather dark with use, every tool in its place where I had put it last, whenever that was. The smallest tweezers, the ones Franz had given me, were still wrapped in a square of oilcloth. Under the roll, in the corner of the box, was the card. Franz had given it to me on my last day in Geneva in 1998, when I was 26 and packing my things and flying back to New York to start at Holt and Vane. He had not given it to me in any ceremonial way. He slid it across the bench while I was putting my tools away, and then he went back to what he was doing, and I put it in the box with the tools, and I had not read it again until now. It was an index card, unlined, written in his small, precise hand in black ink that had gone slightly brown at the edges. His English was formal in writing in a way it wasn't in speech. It said, "A watch that no longer runs still carries every second it ever kept. So does a careful man." I read it once. I sat at the table for a little while longer. Through the window above the sink, the street was dark and quiet, one streetlight with a small corona of insects still orbiting it even in November. The furnace clicked on and the house filled for a moment with the smell of warm air and dust. I rolled the tools back up and tied the cord. I set the loop on top. I closed the lid. I turned off the kitchen light.